Is the notion of legalising cannabis finally moving from the political fringe into the mainstream? Next week, the Dáil will debate the Cannabis Regulation Bill 2013, which aims to legalise and regulate the use of cannabis for recreational and medical use. Independent TD Luke Ming Flanagan is bringing forward the proposed legislation, which follows on from similar moves in the US states of Colorado and Washington. So, is it time to legalise the weed? Deputy Flanagan joins us, as do Dr. Garret McGovern, a GP dealing with alcohol and substance abuse, psychiatrist Dr. Bobby Smith, and John Mooney, the security correspondent of the Sunday Times. Luke Ming Flanagan, to you first. Why this legislation and why now?
Well, because the current law isn't working, and we can see around the planet that there are moves to change these laws. Colorado and Washington, as you've already said, have gone down the complete and utter legalisation route, as has the country of Uruguay. We have anything between 150 and 250,000 people in this country who use cannabis. We have an estimate of over 100,000 people who now have a criminal record for it. It does not stop people using it. It makes life more dangerous for those people that use it because it's illegal. It makes the substance more dangerous. And the really sad part about it is we're talking about resources in this country at the moment. The fact that it's illegal leaves all of that money in the criminal underground. I estimate that this could be worth in the region of 300 million euros to the economy, and I believe that is a very conservative estimate.
Well, just to pick up on that point of revenue, Colorado, which is a roughly similar population, is talking about in the region of about 50 million euro in terms of tax revenue. Your figure seems to be much higher. How's that?
Well, it isn't just for tax revenue. I'm basing my figures on several different things. One of them is that there was a study recently done in Israel which showed that it would be worth 450 million American dollars to their economy. Now, there isn't just the money that you'd raised through taxation. You also have the situation whereby 8,000 people every year are criminalised for using this substance. That costs the country a small fortune. Obviously, we won't know for definite how much it's going to save the country and how much it's going to raise the country. But come this time next year, when they have, at that stage, gone through it in Colorado and Washington and Uruguay, and we have real data, we will be able to speak even more authoritatively on this. But you asked the question, has it moved to the mainstream? 58% in the US in the last opinion poll said they'd agree with it. The opinion poll on the journal.ie, when you exclude don't knows, is over 50%.
Well, John Mooney, what about that? Move it out of illegality and into the taxable mainstream?
Well, there's a great need to look at reform of the penal laws, looking at drugs and how people are treated when they're caught with drugs. I would disagree with what Luke is saying for a number of different reasons, and I respectfully disagree. There was a facility in 2005 where Gardaí could use an adult caution to caution someone who was caught with cannabis for possession. That was only in for literally a couple of days, and then it was got rid of. I think there's anyone in law enforcement or treatment services, etc., and look at this, the problem of drug use in society, would argue that there's a grave need for the reintroduction of that to allow Gardaí not to charge people.
But are they actually charging people? Because
anyone under 18 doesn't get charged. You get a juvenile caution. By and large, in reality, people aren't being charged when they're caught with small amounts of cannabis because it would clog up the system if that was the case.
But what about legalising cannabis?
In terms of legalising, there's a number of different reasons why that simply won't happen, I don't believe, in Europe. For a start, it wouldn't remove the business from organised crime. Any sort of legitimate business that organised criminal networks are already involved in, have established networks. History has shown that you clamp down on these groups, it simply don't go away. Number one, if you legitimise or legalise the production of cannabis in the morning, they'd simply undercut it by importing it from elsewhere.
When's the last time you bought black market alcohol?
Well, black market alcohol is a massive problem.
Because it's legal.
Sorry, Luke, you're absolutely completely wrong on that. Black market alcohol is a massive problem in this country at the moment, as is black market diesel, as is black market unleaded petrol and contraband cigarettes. It's massive.
When's the last time you bought it?
Well, I don't actually drink myself, but as I say, it's...
I don't recall ever buying it.
But that's not the point. I mean, people do buy black market alcohol, they do buy illegal tobacco, they do buy illegal diesel. So why wouldn't they buy illegal cannabis?
And they also buy televisions that are stolen, but you wouldn't ban them to solve that problem. That would be ridiculous.
but that is really not comparing like with like. The other matter is that
well, you were saying because it's involved in the black market.
Well, hold on.
No, what I'm saying to you is that if I'm not quite sure what the purpose of this bill is. Is it to reduce harm?
Have you read it?
I have actually read parts of it. I haven't went through it fully, but I've read your synopsis and that. But the purpose of the bill, what is the purpose of the bill? Is the purpose of the bill to reduce harm? Is it combat organised crime? Is it to stop people from entering the criminal justice system? If it was entering the criminal justice system, you could simply have the reintroduction of an adult caution. If it was a case, it would simply. No, Luke, if you let me finish, it also it's very important to note that legalising something that's already illicit doesn't stop organised crime gangs. If you believe it does, you've no experience of those type of organisations. Certainly, it's worthwhile to have a debate on how we treat people who use drugs and the reasons why they use drugs. But certainly, if you introduce a benign system for drug use of any kind, be it any type of the illegal drugs, it does confer a legitimacy on that, and that is problematic.
Okay, well, I want to bring
excluding alcohol yet again.
I want to bring in Dr. Garret McGovern. You are a GP, you deal with substance abuse, you deal with alcohol abuse. If you legalise this, the argument will be made, if you legalise it, more people will use it, and there are harmful side effects to cannabis.
Yeah, absolutely, but the reality is, if you look at the experiences in countries that have relaxed on the laws, there hasn't been an increase in cannabis use. I don't think it's sustainable to try and police pretty much unpoliceable situation by criminalising and stigmatising users of this drug. It simply doesn't work. It costs an awful lot of money. And, you know, for every seizure we hear, we read 2 over the weekend, there's a number of drugs that get through the system. It doesn't affect, there's 160 million people worldwide using cannabis, and it isn't affected by the legal status of that drug.
But is it harmful?
If you look at the Lancet study in 2010, David Nutt, who was the advisor to the UK government, showed that cannabis was well down in the pantheon of harms. It's a relatively less harmful drug than other drugs.
Bobby Smith, relatively less harmful?
It's a bit like comparing apples and oranges, or which is more dangerous, a shark or a tiger. Depends where you are and what you're doing. The truth is, cannabis does have harms. Those harms are, I suppose, the group most at risk of those are young people. I'm absolutely convinced by the evidence linking cannabis use to subsequent development of schizophrenia. It's also very well established that people with serious mental health problems who abuse cannabis, that greatly exacerbates those conditions. Cannabis is associated with depression. Cannabis is also associated with a decline in IQ for people who commence use during adolescence. And I'm really concerned that what this bill will do, it will result in increased use of cannabis by people in Ireland. I think that's inevitable. If you make a drug more accessible, more normal, guarantee its quality, a lot of the barriers to use at the moment will be diminished, so use will increase.
And you're saying that will harm people?
Of course it will.
Okay.
Like 10 or 15% of people who use cannabis experience significant problems as a result of that use.
Okay, can I bring in somebody in the audience? Dr. Fiona Weldon, you deal with these issues all the time. What's your view of this?
Well, I have to say, I mean, Rutland Centre treats this as a primary addiction as well as a comorbid addiction. I'd share Bobby's view in relation to the harm. I think not only does cannabis make it more likely that somebody might develop a schizophrenia or a psychosis, it's also linked to paranoia, all forms of anxiety disorders. But also, I'm more concerned about the untreated mental health problems that people are using cannabis because of. And I think it's a kind of a self-medication for many people.
Hear, hear.
And that's a huge concern that I have. But also, I'm kind of concerned about the content of the bill, which I have looked fairly carefully at as well. I mean, you know, when we talk about regulation, it's quite an appealing word. And another word for that could be policing. And when we think about regulation as policing, the difficulties and the challenges around that, I think, are going to be quite similar to the challenges that we face in terms of policing as it is right now. When we think about for example, one aspect of the bill talks about this institute of, research, and when we look at the content of what that research actually involves, It's talking about research into the benefits of cannabis use, research into the benefits of safe use of safe cultivation, safe use. And I think I'm very concerned about that because the bill is positioned very carefully in an embedded view, rather than it being representative of acknowledging there's a risk here too.
Okay, well, can I put that point to Ming Flanagan? You know, there is a concern being expressed there. We've heard concerns expressed about the health impact of cannabis use.
Well, look at, as far as I am concerned, the negative health impacts of cannabis are greatly exaggerated. We often hear, for a start, about the gateway effect, which, if was true, they should have an absolute epidemic of cocaine users in the Netherlands, when in fact, if you look at the facts, you are 1.8% of the population in the Netherlands have a lifetime use of cocaine. That figure is 8.5 times higher in the United States of America.
But just to stick on the never mind the gateway for the moment, but just to stick on the effects of cannabis, we've heard from professionals in the field who say there is an impact. Well, an adverse, very serious adverse health impact. A study done by the NACD in relation to many people bring up a down health side such as lack of motivation. The NACD showed quite clearly that the people who were more likely to have used cannabis are people who are CEOs, high up in the civil service, and people who had degrees. So, I mean, when you hear that, you have to think again and look at some of this stuff that you have been told about well, Bobby
cannabis.
Smith, do you have a reaction to that?
You do get cannabis use across the socioeconomic spectrum, and you do get some people who are high achieving who use cannabis, but when you do look at surveys of cannabis users themselves, what they identify as the main concerns they have about their own use of cannabis is 1, impact on memory, 2, impact on concentration, and you know, it's the mental health issues that go with it, and actually reductions in motivation. People recognise that. I deal with teenagers with, you know, drug problems. Cannabis is now forming an increased proportion of my work. Compared to 5 years ago. It seems to be a very different drug now than was available 5 years ago, and it's what teenagers would say themselves.
But the question is, I mean, what is criminalising any harms due to cannabis? I mean, what is criminalising it doing to help that? I mean, the reality of it is that schizophrenia is a relatively rare diagnosis, probably less than 1% of global incidence of the disease. The vast majority of people who use cannabis, the vast majority don't develop schizophrenia. This has been overplayed in terms of the effects of cannabis. I just don't think it is sustainable to have this drug well down the list of harmful drugs when alcohol is top of that list and it's legal. Okay, well, can I go back to my audience again? Stuart Clark, you're Deputy Editor of Hot Press. I think you're a campaigner on this issue. Part of the Normal Ireland Steering Committee. I see this as a pro-health and anti-crime bill. I think we've got about 250,000 people. The only reason they're breaking the law on a regular basis is because cannabis is illegal. And they have no option but to give their money to criminals, both of the sort of nidge, love-hate variety and the Mr. and Senor Bigs in countries like Mexico, where actually a lot of people die because of, you know, satisfying our need for illegal drugs. It has definitely moved into the mainstream. Bill Clinton said recently that the biggest failure of American foreign policy in the last 50 years is the so-called war on drugs. We had our launch last Thursday, and on the platform were 2 eminent doctors, including Dr. McGovern, but also the former Chief Constable of Cambridgeshire, the former Chief Constable of Durham is very much in favour. Law enforcement in America and the UK and other European countries is seeing that the war on drugs has failed, and we need new thinking. And we also see contaminated supplies of cannabis. There was a horrific incident a few years ago where cannabis was found sprayed with liquid glass. Now, if you legalise and make sure that the quality of the drug is better, you are reducing harm. But I mean, there is level of harm associated with the use of cannabis. Well, there's use and abuse, and it's certainly less harmful than alcohol and tobacco. But does that mean you should legalise it? Well, I think, you know, there's a very persuasive argument to take it away from the criminals. I disagree with the gentleman there. I think, you know, removing any source of income for the love-hate brigade is a good idea. Okay. But also you bring it out of this sort of netherworld where people who do, the minority who have problems, will be willing to stand up and address them. Okay, well, could I bring in Liz Dillon? You're there. I think you're a parent and you're concerned about this. You're also, I think, associated with Fine Gael.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm a mother of 4, and I would be really, really concerned that if basically cannabis was legalised, that basically would be more readily available for teenagers. And I don't think that there's enough education in secondary schools with regard to the effects on mental health issues from cannabis consumption as well.
Okay, Luke Ming-Fan, do you want to come
Well, when you mention consumption, in an environment where cannabis was illegal in Britain from 1972 to 2002, the amount of people who use cannabis, in the adults who use cannabis, increased 4-fold. The people under 18, it increased 18-fold. And back to your schizophrenia argument, during that period, the amount of people with schizophrenia in Britain actually reduced, or at worst stayed the same.
Okay, Anne Jeffers, where are you? What's your response to that?
I'm a consultant psychiatrist, and I would certainly over the last 5 and 10 years have seen an increase in psychosis from people who are using cannabis. I certainly couldn't support any bill that would legalise a substance that we know causes harm, as Dr. Smith has said. We certainly see an increase in schizophrenia. In certain vulnerable individuals, the increase is 6 times that of people who haven't used cannabis.
Okay, could I bring in Sean Lynch, please? You're students.
Students for Sensible Drug Policy. We have 2 chapters in Cork and Galway. What we try to do is provide a platform for students to engage with specific drug-related problems such as contamination, chemical imbalance. We bring insightful speakers in so students can engage without having to get involved with the subculture that's largely anonymous. I'd like to point out that basically this is not a temporary global phenomenon that's going to disappear if we keep pumping millions into it. And if you think that this doesn't affect you, we arrest something like 20 or 30 cannabis users on average every day. I'd like to know the specifics. If your car gets vandalized or your bike gets stolen, your family member gets attacked, where are those guards? I think we're wasting too much time arresting the wrong people, or resources are in the wrong place.
Okay, could I bring in John Mooney? You obviously cover the whole area of crime and security, so what's your response to that?
Well, what you're talking about simply isn't true. There are people being arrested and stopped with drugs. Of course there are. They're usually coming to the attention of guards for all sorts of reasons. But this bill, to be perfectly frank with you, it's simply unworkable. I mean, it talks about licensing the manufacture of the production of cannabis. At the moment, across Europe, dangerous drugs or anything that can be shown to prove or to cause a harmful effect on someone at some later date, they usually go through, particularly with pharmaceutical drugs, go through rigorous testing, and they're not released onto the market unless they're absolutely seen as safe. I mean, even from a purely, what company is going to get involved in manufacturing cannabis for the simple reason, who would underwrite it, who would insure it, how would that actually work? The security problems involved in something like this are also unforeseen. For example, you'd have a situation where if people were producing cannabis, you'd have obviously the illegal business continuing because there'd be money in it, like with everything else. So again, I'm not quite sure what this is about. Okay, and the other issue is, which you haven't really answered, is why aren't you making a play to maybe legalise other types of drugs if this is to reduce harm, etc., and take people out of the criminal justice system? Why not sort of reduce or legalise heroin?
Interviewing, but when in relation to your experience writing about crime, you may well have written about it, but we had a former member of the British Police Force over last week who actually worked in this area, didn't just write about it, actually worked in Scotland Yard, and he believes that the bill that I am proposing is actually excellent and somewhat conservative, in fact, is what he said. You write about it.
Sorry,
he lived it and
Luke,
he
you're
worked
still
it.
not answering any question I've asked you.
You don't
how would this
ask the questions.
No, but I'm asking
does.
you, how does this work? How would this work?
How do you mean how it will work? Sit down and read the bill.
Well,
how it will work. Okay, in the morning, if it was legal under these proposals, you would be able to purchase up to 1 ounce of cannabis out of a retail store. You would also be able to grow up to 6 plants, but before you'd be able to do that, you would have to get permission from the district court after being vetted by the Cannabis Regulation Authority, in which case then you would get a licence if everyone was happy with that.
And what type of strength cannabis would it be?
Currently, what happens is we get scumbags selling it who shoot people and throw the money into areas where it shouldn't be put into.
But
instead, I suggest put it into the legitimate taxed economy.
Well, if you'd allow me to ask a
Indeed,
question
I look
now.
forward to a question from the real questioner.
Yeah, but I mean, the point about this is, I mean, there's quite a lot of regulation here, and you know, as you say, is fairly conservative in terms of the penalties for under 18s and so on and so forth. But if criminal gangs can get away at the moment with flouting the law, what's to stop them getting away with continuing to flout the law? And as speakers have said, there's
well,
still
the
money
question
in it.
I asked earlier was, has anyone here bought illegal alcohol? I never have. And all I know is, the reason why I don't is because of guarantee of quality and knowing what is in it. And the reason why, in a regulated market, why people would buy it off a legitimate dealer is because they would know what is in it. The packaging would tell you how much THC is in it relative to CBD. You would know the strain, and you would be guaranteed that it wouldn't damage your health, whereas what people are smoking now is actually killing them.
Okay, well, Bobby Smith, there's been a lot of talk about alcohol. Alcohol is more dangerous than cannabis, a lot of people would argue. Is that true?
Again, I go back to the point that you know, it's comparing apples and oranges. They both have different harms. Cannabis has more mental health problems associated with it than cannabis. Alcohol has probably more physical health and social consequences.
But if it was illegal, would you legalise it, alcohol?
I think if we were all to go back in the time capsule 200 years ago when society was debating which drug to go with, I don't know, would we come back and choose alcohol over cannabis, to be honest with you?
I do
know. But don't we know from the American experience that prohibition of anything that there's a big demand for? Yeah. Doesn't really work.
What the great lesson of prohibition is that when you make a drug legally available and normal in a society, it's impossible to reverse that process. The great lesson of prohibition is that you can't go backwards.
Exactly, and cannabis was legal and you can't reverse it in the past.
And we have an interesting social experiment in Ireland which actually does give some clues as to what, as to the pros and cons of prohibition. Last time I was in this room was about 3 years ago. We were debating the head shop phenomenon. We were told these drugs were here to stay. If we ban them, it'll all go to the black market. It'll all go underground. Rates of use will remain as high as they were back then. We took the brave step of banning them, and rates of use, they haven't disappeared, but they're a fraction of what they were before.
Black market, Bobby.
I know there is some of the black market, but the rates of use and the number of people...
It's gone on to the communities that can least deal with those drugs.
The number of people experiencing harm as a result of use of those drugs is a fraction of what it was, and psychiatrists will confirm that across the country. Our emergency departments will confirm that across the country. They're not seeing people presenting with acute problems associated with those substances.
Okay, yeah, with alcohol though, aren't they?
I just want to go back to the audience very quickly. Rosaleen McElvenny, where are you? Hi, Rosaleen. What's your view on all this?
Well, I think it's useful to be having a debate about it, particularly the issue about alcohol. And I do want to take issue with Bobby in relation to the mental health difficulties associated with alcohol vis-à-vis cannabis, because there are huge mental health difficulties associated with alcohol use and abuse. And I think there was a recent UK expert group reviewed the issue of alcohol and cannabis use, and they pointed out that in terms of harm to self, alcohol was twice as harmful as cannabis, and in terms of harm to others, alcohol was 5 times as harmful to others as it was in relation to alcohol.
And so you're a psychotherapist, right?
Psychotherapist and psychologist.
Okay, William Flannery, Dr. William Flannery, where are you?
Over here. I'm from the College of Psychiatrists, and I run an addiction service in the Midlands, so I'd like to support what Bobby has said so far. And unfortunately, Ming, I'm seeing the effects of the better quality cannabis out there, as there is much higher strength cannabis preparations. So I'm seeing people coming into me who are younger and younger and more severely dependent than what I've seen before. And albeit maybe 1% of the population with schizophrenia is maybe a small percentage, but it translates as 50,000 people who are inherently sensitive to the harmful effects of cannabis.
Yeah, but Willie, with all due respect, criminalising that drug is not going to have any effect whatsoever on those rates. People are still going to use these drugs.
Do you not think it's very dangerous to set up a situation where you have a benign attitude to a drug?
I'm just very interested in benign attitude. The reality of it is, why are we reinventing the wheel? The reality of it is, this has been done in other countries. The laws have been relaxed, and it has not led to increased harm and increased use, indeed.
Yes, sorry, in the countries where it has been introduced.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to have to wrap it up. There's a couple of comments in. Luke, would you give cannabis to your children? when they reach age, I presume?
No, I wouldn't, and that doesn't mean it's dangerous, but I think there's a lot of things you wouldn't give to children that you could give to adults.
Okay.
It's a rubbish argument.
Another comment, I'm not into drugs, but I do think criminalising users only serves to compound the problem. What does it cost to fail to deal with it? By legalising cannabis, they're introducing a new brand of young people that will start on it because they think it's okay, just like cigarettes. This will only lead to more comments. There's only a few of the comments we've had in. Just very finally, do you accept that this bill is going nowhere at the moment?
Well, what I have to say is, since we started talking about this a week ago, I have been amazed at the positive attitude from the general public.
Okay.
Not surprised at the fact that politicians are behind yet again and will have to catch up.
Okay, well, we'll hear more about this next week in the Dáil. Miriam.